Hello, everyone. I'm Cory.
And I'm Isaac, and we are going to talk about movies.
Woo.
We did it.
Yeah.
We executed the intro.
Yeah. So the movie we just watched yesterday, actually, was Them That Follow.
The 2019 American thriller film written and directed by Britt Poulton and Dan Madison Savage.
Yeah.
In their directorial debuts, and I will now stop reading the Wikipedia page verbatim.
Is it also their writing debuts?
So they have written before, but their credits are pretty limited. I did a cursory IMDb search because I hadn't heard either of their names. And what comes up for Britt Poulton is one feature film writing credit on something obscure that I had never heard of, and then a writing credit on a short film, which she co-wrote alongside Dan Madison Savage, is what it looked like.
Okay.
So they are relative unknowns. I'm not sure what the story is behind how they came across this packed cast to join on to their project, but here we are.
Yeah, it's also from 1091 Media, which I believe on an also cursory glance is not very big yet. They're just starting out their distribution and production work, and I know absolutely nothing about it.
I haven't heard of it either. They got the new trend of just having short names that have numbers in them, like
A24, our favorite, yeah.
That's the only one.
Anyways, so Them That Follow, even though it is from very new directors and writers, and even the rest of the crew, I didn't know the cinematographer or editor either, but I didn't look them up.
Prominently produced by Gerard Butler.
Oh, yeah, he has
of the
top
upcoming
production credit.
Angel Has Fallen. I guess he's getting a little chunky, getting less action hero roles these days, getting into the behind-the-scenes stuff, and I, for one, am very thankful in our Lord and Savior, Gerard Butler, for giving us Them to Follow, because I was impressed by this film.
I was as well. And I think what's going to stand out to most people, despite the fact that the crew is not well known, is a very amazing cast that you have definitely seen multiple people of before.
Just to list them off, Olivia Colman, of probably most prominently The Favorite fame, Best Actress winner last year at the Oscars, got a whole lot of attention for that role, which is one of my absolute favorite performances in recent memory. So I am all on the Olivia Colman bandwagon.
You might have seen Caitlin Dever in the recent movie, what was that? Booksmart, yeah. Apparently she was also in Justified, which is interesting because Walton Goggins also in the movie.
Walton Goggins has what is probably the most flashy role in this film as the preacher, the small town preacher in this religious community that I think almost comes across as cultish. Actually, I think pretty much does come across as cultish.
Yeah.
They reference multiple times being threatened by outside law enforcement authorities and are obviously a very small and tight-knit community. So
to not give away too much of the story, not that there's like major spoilers in this, but we'll get to that later. The basic idea of the story is that the main character, who is played by Alice Englert, is the pastor's daughter. The pastor is played by Walton Goggins in this mountainous, isolated town, and they all go to a church that is very Pentecostal in nature. There's a lot of yelling hallelujah and, spirits and speaking in tongues type situation. Not that they literally do that, but that's kind of the general idea. A lot of shouting, a lot of intense stuff going on. And the key point of the movie is that they are very reliant on every aspect of their lives being influenced by the power of the spirit. They don't use medicine or things like that. They just allow the spirit to cure everything in their lives and provide everything in their lives. So that comes into play. There's this really striking scene early on also that highlights that fact, the dependence on faith and on Walton Goggins' connection with the higher authority that they bow down to when he is healing that young boy who is afflicted with some mysterious disease of some sort. It's not specified, but there's this very intense scene that lets Walton Goggins flex his Walton Goggins muscles and just ham it up as he tries to expel the demons from this boy, basically, in this mini exorcism of sorts. Yeah, it definitely got the exorcism feel in it. And the other element that makes it the most cult-like is the snakes, which, if you've seen the trailer, they are a little bit in. what they use the snakes for is kind of a symbol of sin and the power that the devil has over humans.
Temptation.
Right, yeah, everything that the Bible talks about. And they use that real venomous live snakes in their church to symbolize, you know, God's spirit and how he is protecting you from this evil.
Mm-hmm.
It's never, like, specifically said, but that's obviously why the police have got involved multiple times in the situation, because there's literally the danger and the actual happening of people getting bit in the service, of people dying from it, because then they can't be treated. They don't believe in hospitals, in medicine, so...
I think they do actually at one point explicitly say that the snakes have been confiscated before, and that is why the law enforcement is after them.
So they're literally putting people in danger to symbolize what, you know, the healing power of the spirit, I guess.
At a few important points in the movie, the snakes are both a symbol of everything Cory just described and also a much more immediate and potentially fatal test of faith. In a very physical sense, like God judging the worshippers that Pastor Child leads and deciding whether or not they are worthy to continue along his divine path, more or less.
Our main character, who's played by Alice Englert, her name's Mara, discovers that she's pregnant. This is the classic setup of the scenario where she is in a very devout community and the pastor's daughter, but in a very difficult situation of an extreme transgression that could potentially ruin her whole life.
And interestingly, the film picks up just after the inciting incident, the affair that prompts this entire conflict to take place. We see a bit of the romantic spark between her and the man Augie, who is her forbidden lover, but we don't actually witness the fiery passion for each other.
It's already after that. And while she's dealing with this, the other key element is that she is soon to be accepting the marriage proposal of another man.
Right.
Yes.
In some ways, it's a extremely traditional setup. It's like a Jane Austen novel set in the Appalachian Mountains. But what we want to highlight, I think, in this episode, and just with regard to our experience of this film, are the myriad of details that elevated this experience above its formulaic trappings.
Yeah, I think we both agree in the totality of the movie, the script itself is probably the least interesting part, right? The literal story is not the most compelling aspect. It's really the finer details that were put into it through filmmaking craft, through the very good cast, with a fair focus on all of the characters, surprisingly, or at least all the ones that we need to see. Further, the cinematography and editing, there's never a shot wasted. It feels very weighted, very important, like there's something on the verge of happening.
I do think that we should not imply that in terms of craftsmanship, this is a pristine film. There's
right,
definitely
imperfect for sure.
Yeah, there's definitely the mark of an inexperienced filmmaker who is still figuring out the best way to pace out a film, and there are a couple of sections that drag on a bit and that kind of lose that propulsive forward momentum that carries a lot of the second half of the film, whereas the first half is more meditative setup. It's just sort of establishing the environment and the characters that the rest of the film will transpire in, which I found very compelling. But then we kind of hit this big moment towards the midpoint, which we'll probably be talking about in more detail a little bit later, and the pace gets a bit scrambled up as the film figures out how to transition into the more intense build-up towards its climax, but then it puts the pieces back together, ends up finding its footing by the end, and really hits the mark where it counts. That is exciting because we have a pair of new writer-directors here that have still plenty of things to figure out, and yet also considerable potential being shown in this film.
Yeah, and I think we both definitely came out of the theater with more good things to say than bad. That imperfect element, while showing that this is new writer-directors creating the film, it also, similar to, I think, what we talked about in Lulu Wang's film, The Farewell, it has an inspiration that, while it's extremely inferior to that film, has very compelling and unique aspects of it, despite a very simple setup. So one thing that I think we should really talk about first is how compelled we were by the cast.
It's an outstanding ensemble, really. undoubtedly the standout is Jim Gaffigan.
Yeah, questionable inclusion. I mean,
stands more to make you question every once in a while, wait, why is Jim Gaffigan?
Yeah, it's a little distracting.
But then sometimes it's enjoyable to watch him play this hick guy.
Yeah, it's a very serious film in that there's no humor at all. There is literally no comic relief in the film. Mm-hmm. So the fact that Jim Gaffigan plays a supporting character and he has multiple lines too. It's not like he's just in the background at all times.
Although he is in the background for like the entire first hour of the movie, and then at the end
I guess
claims a slightly more prominent role and starts spouting some lines. Doesn't really have much in the way of a character arc, but he says things. I think we can move on from the role of Gaffigan because he's really the least notable of the headlining cast members.
Let's set up this situation, this cast of characters a little bit better so we can start digging into why we find them so interesting. The first group I think we should talk about is the case with Alice Englert's character Mara, Walton Goggins' character Lemuel, and maybe Caitlin Dever on that, and also her soon-to-be husband, played by Lewis Pullman. Garrett, that's right. This group is all a very devout, it seems initially, right? They're all a very devout group. They're very central in the church and kind of all portray the classic, like, 100% devotion to God. However, I think we can continue this conversation by really picking apart the finer details here.
Mm-hmm. So you immediately are presented with Mara as this character who's undergoing intense inner turmoil, conflict over whether she has committed a mortal sin or is following in her heart and doing what she loves, which sounds on the surface like a very shallow inner conflict, but the way that it's depicted and the nuance of Englert's performance and the relationship that she has with her father, Pastor Childs, really sells it as a more profound philosophical conflict going on in her head. And as the film develops, you really get the sense for Mara's budding independence, and though she does not have some kind of complete transformation, denunciation of her faith by the end of the film, she does undergo a sort of incremental stepping stone breaking free of the intense bonds that hold her captive at the beginning of the film. And that's just a broad summary of her character arc.
Yeah, no, but it points out some important things, right? That she, even when with conversations with Augie, her lover, who is not a churchgoer, it's clear that she is never really questioning her faith fully. She is more just wrestling with her actions under the only kind of aspect that she knows about it. I don't think there's a point where she's ever questioning the existence of God or like having that level of inner turmoil. It's really just how she can deal with God's judgment, her community's judgment, right? It's just the setup of this impossible situation that she is wrestling with. And that clarification, I think, makes the film very interesting to me. It really is, I would say, one of the main driving forces that she's not ever about to jump out of this community. She's not ever about to leave her faith. I mean, except maybe by the end. And yet, we still get an intense inner turmoil that is both literally indicated with the actions of the film, as well as with the meditative musings that we see at the beginning, with her expression, with her action, with the way that she goes about everything. Her face alone tells as much of the story as any of the dialogue.
Yeah. Piggybacking off of all of that, there are multiple points of no return in the story where Mara is faced with circumstances that are unpleasant, to put it mildly, and is forced to just bear forward and decide whether she is going to bend to the guilt that she knows would present itself if she went public with a lot of these mistakes that she's made, or to sort of continue forward quietly and just see where she ends up. And a lot of the film just has to do with Mara and other characters dealing with the fallout of their decisions. And that sounded kind of simple the way I put it.
Well, I think it's simple in action and significant in its overarching meaning.
Mara, as a character, is not super clearly presented in terms of how she looks at things by the beginning or the end of the film. There's not a clear transition point where she denounces her faith, like you were saying. That's also true of another character played by Caitlin Dever, Dilly Piggott, who is initially portrayed as seemingly a close friend of Mara's. And we talked about this coming out of the theater because although her character doesn't necessarily undergo a significant evolution over the course of the film, it feels like she does because as you come to realize watching the movie, you really don't know her until the film's end, when you finally realize that a lot of what you had assumed about her place in the world, her loyalty to Mara, and the degree of her devoutness was actually a misrepresentation, right? Mara and Dilly, you initially assume to be very close friends, almost like sisters, and then by the end of the film, you're questioning whether they really were close at all, or in fact
even
just
friends,
or even friends, or rather just companions out of necessity because they're the only two women in their community of anywhere near the same age.
Yeah, that was definitely one of my favorite aspects of the film. I think ultimately finding out that Caitlin Dever's character was more alleged to her faith than to her friendship with Mara, we realize at the end that she actually was not really looking out for Mara at all. And we found out only near the end that she didn't even know she was pregnant through the whole film. At the beginning, it starts with they both go to a grocery store, not a grocery store, kind of a gas station stop thing, and Mara steals a pregnancy test to check if she's pregnant. I assumed, I guess, that Dilly was also in on the situation, but turns out at the end that this was totally something that Mara was dealing with alone. By the end, you realize how isolated she was and how isolating it is to a person in her situation.
Yeah.
This whole thing that's going on.
And her relationship with Dilly really accentuates that fact because it's this false promise of that kind of real human connection that might have made this whole situation easier for Mara. So it kind of tears the rug out from under you right at the finale and works to just highlight, that isolation that you already talked about.
Yeah, and it says so much, too, about, I think, what Polton and Savage are trying to say about religion in general, or at least this specific situation of the character, in that they're literally being set up to be alone in their situation, right? The oppression that we see time and time again of women in these devout Christian communities where they're forced into wife situations, where they're forced into very specific situations and very slave-like situations, right? We get to see her interaction with Garrett, and when Garrett starts really coming into his role as the future husband, it becomes more and more clear his devout faith is really just kind of another way to take over her life, just like her father and pastor, the same person, have also taken over her entire life. I mean, it said so much to me about, I think, what they were trying to say about religion in general, the very specific situation that you put in, where you really have to only have one line of thought, and if you're outside of that, you're going to be in a very tricky spot.
The role of her father in keeping her trapped in that, quote, really tricky spot that you're talking about is especially claustrophobic, I think, in the way it's depicted, because not only does he have the grip over her as her father and her pastor, but he also is close friends with Garrett and is almost nursing him as like a protege of sorts to like take up care of his daughter and also become a husband to her. And so he's actually, at a couple points throughout the film, we see him give Garrett these tips where he's sort of nudging him towards this iron-fisted husband role that the men in their community are taught to adopt, and indoctrinating Garrett just as much as he's indoctrinating all of his other subjects.
And I think it was not accidental that Garrett was presented as a recent person in the church. Convert. Like he did not, a recent convert, there we go. They mentioned that he did not grow up in this situation and he was brought in, it doesn't say why, but he came into this and now is one of the more devout members, right? It just took over his life. And that element of filling the hole with religion, with whatever, shows later when he gets drunk and he starts acting crazy. To me, that indicated that maybe that was something else that he had done in the past, like he had drank a lot or had other vices that he had to then replace with religion and was needing, trying to continually fill that kind of hole. Going back on what Isaac was saying, there's a key point also where Walton Goggins says to Lewis Pullman, he says, you gotta act like a man. Yeah. I can't teach Mara to be a wife. That's your job, and that's God's law, right? The situation that they're putting Mara in is so justified by the male duty of being a Christian or being whatever, being a religious Jesus follower.
Mm-hmm. The degree to which Childs, Goggins' character, pushes Garrett ends up being too much for Garrett, as we see in that scene you mentioned briefly where he gets drunk and then actually almost rapes Mara.
Spoiler
or
alert.
attempts to force himself upon her. I mean, we've already established that we're going to spoil things in this podcast, and it's this horrific scene, and also one that is completely senseless, and obviously ends up being interrupted by Childs, whose house it is, who is just sitting in the other room praying, who is going to get involved in this because he's 10 yards away. And he comes in, he grabs Garrett around the throat, and he throws him out of the house, and he threatens him with a rifle. And on one hand, it's this moment of like, get him, like, almost rooting for Goggins' character at this point in the movie. And then you realize that the entire situation has been orchestrated by him. And that although he is acting as this protector of his daughter, he's really just acting as another male figure that pigeonholes her into this domesticated, helpless wife role that has been pre-selected for her and that she is resistant to.
Yeah, had this same situation happened after they had had a traditional ceremony and been officially married, I don't know if he would have intervened the same way. If this had been, say, in their own house away from Walton Goggins and he found out afterwards, he might not have reacted the same way. But he's protecting God's rule for an unmarried woman in his house.
Right.
So, yeah.
And he's protecting God's rule, and it's called into question whether he's really even protecting his daughter at all, because what does he do immediately after that? He puts her in his car and takes her to the church and puts a poisonous snake around her neck and forces her to be judged by God's will. But anyway, so that is that sect of the cast. There's this other group of characters that is headlined by Olivia Colman's character, whose name is Miss Slaughter. Do you want to talk a bit about her role in the film?
Yeah, so she plays one of the top female members in the church. She, at least one of the oldest.
Interestingly, it's dropped that she was not born into the community, but was
true. But I mean, it is a small community, so it could just be that she's just been there the longest, even if she wasn't born in there.
True.
So her family, Jim Gaffigan, is her husband, and Augie, who we've mentioned before, is her son. So one of the most devout members of the church, Olivia Colman's character, her son is this ex-churchgoer young man who is impregnating Mara and, talking about leaving the community altogether, right? Mm-hmm. He mentions he got a house and a new job and he's going to be moving away right before some crazy stuff happens.
Mm-hmm. Coleman is phenomenal. She has... I know that... what was the one scene that you mentioned?
Oh, yeah. I'd say, aside from Walton Goggins, who just had this electrifying role, Olivia Colman definitely stood out more than any other character in the film, because it became so noticeable to me because she's a very understated role initially in the film, and then when she finds out first that Mara is pregnant, and she realizes, okay, right, you shouldn't tell them, she kind of sets up that it's okay, that, she just needs to figure it out herself. But when she finds out that it's actually Augie's child, she immediately kicks into like another level of breaking that plane of like the acting reservation that she had, just whatever was holding back her character, and just goes for it on Augie, right? She tells him that he's gonna burn, he's gonna go to hell, he has to re-enter the church, right? She is literally begging him to save his soul because she knows, she is 100% certain in her faith and knows that because of what he did, he's going to hell.
It really is like a mask comes off and her fear just shines through rather than anything else. Another thing about her character is that she is arguably, alongside Mara, the only character that really undergoes a transformative arc. And by the end of the film, we see Slaughter let go of her faith enough, like loosen her grip on it enough to admit to herself that she cares more about her son's life than about her son's afterlife, I guess, because she allows him ultimately to be transported to town to get medical attention for the snake bite that I don't actually think we'd explicitly
we did not, but
he
he tries to go in the back to the church for Mara's sake, and immediately ends up getting bitten by the snake, and Goggins...
And you just see it coming, because you're like...
Right, of course. I mean, the film, is showing rattlesnakes coiling up the whole time. I mean, somebody's going to get bitten. It's like...
Chekhov's snake.
Yeah, there you go. That's a good reference, actually.
The episode title, baby.
Quick aside to the characters that we're talking about. Not only are we being portrayed in the situation as this very, this entrapment on Mara's character, but I think the filmmaking aspect also did that as well. With the snakes always being present, always seeming like, they're always portrayed with the right kind of music to convey that there's probably going to be somebody bitten at some point. It's going to happen soon. That tension is created through the whole film through music, through close-up shots, through somehow like really making the cinematography seem very suffocating. Mm-hmm. The forest doesn't seem like a wide expanse. It seems like you literally have nowhere to go.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, you get a lot of shots of characters framed with the forest behind them, like scenes in cars where the trees are zooming by in the background, scenes in yards where you can just sort of see the tree line in the background. You never get like a helicopter shot of the forest from above.
That's a good point.
You never get anything that really shows a vast expanse on screen. All you see is the way that the trees box the characters in visually. Then at the very end of the film, when Mara and Augie finally leave the mountains, there is this sense of openness to the landscape around them.
I like that a lot.
That contrasts, that contrasts very simply, but very nicely with the previously suffocating, as you put it, surroundings. Speaking of that escape that bookends the film, the degree to which Mara escapes is something that we briefly talked about earlier, about how she doesn't fully denounce her faith. She more incrementally breaks out of the strictness of it.
Quick aside, I think that's exactly what Olivia Colman's character is doing as well. And that's why I think we see that a little bit of a dual arc there.
Mm-hmm. For two women at very different points in their lives, yet undergoing a sort of similar process. However, what in the film makes it clear that Mara is not fully denouncing her faith? Well, for one, she is breaking out of her community, but she is still running away with a man who she loves in what is implied to be a traditional relationship to come for her character, or at least that's what I got from it, is that, she has this man's child in her, and that she is leaving, and she might be breaking out of this community, but she still has every intention of raising this child very traditionally with this man who she feels she sees and who she loves in this very conventional kind of storybook fashion. That is one of the traditional elements that her character maintains.
And I think one of the reasons why we see that, or why we assume that, is because her interactions with Augie are never, ooh, I'm escaping my faith now, right? She still talks about it a lot and says, this is a very important part of my life. This is very essential to my life. And doesn't necessarily criticize Augie for it, but knows her own feelings on it, or at least what she thinks her own feelings are on it.
Mm-hmm. Even by the climax of the film, she makes a very explicit choice that clarifies her ongoing connection to her faith, and that is her choice to allow her father to put her through the ritualistic snake test. Because what happens is, to reiterate, she has this horrific run-in with Garrett, which her father intervenes in, and then he takes her to the church. She undergoes the snake test. The snake doesn't bite her, and then she walks out the door while her father says, if you walk out the door, you can't come back, right? And my first question was, well, why didn't she just walk out the door of her house before that and dodge the bit with the rattlesnake crawling around on her body and threatening to bite her? If she's already breaking free of these religious customs, then why did she care at all whether or not the snake bites her? And then after we talked about it a little bit, what was going to be a criticism turned into actually something that added to the film's nuance for me, because it's another example of how she's not fully denouncing her faith, of how she is still very much wrapped up in the judgment of the God that she has been following all of her life. And that although she cares enough about Augie and about her child and about her well-being to claim her own independence by the end of the film and walk out the door despite her father's threats, she still feels it is her duty or her desire to undergo the test of faith. She still chooses to do that. She makes she has agency in that scenario, and she chooses to do that.
Right. Yeah, and with the last interaction she has with Olivia Colman, she's not taking Augie to a hospital and away from the community because she thinks God is not real anymore. She's doing it because she knows that Augie still doesn't believe. And I think at this point she has accepted that as part of him, and maybe in the future we could see them developing that relationship a little bit more, figuring that out. But in that moment she knows he's not going to be saved in this situation, right? I don't know if it's clear whether or not she believes that God can cure people's illnesses, but it's very clear that she knows it won't happen for him, and so she is using that newfound agency to take him out of that situation.
And there are so many people who, it seems, are willing to let this whole process unfold upon Augie, who are so locked into their faith that they are ready to watch this young man die without medical attention because they genuinely believe that it means he was tested by the Lord and failed the Lord's test.
And actually, the dad, Jim Gaffigan, kind of does that too a little bit, even though he doesn't have as clear of a character arc because he's a very much supporting character. He even realizes that he's not going to live unless we cut off his arm, right?
Or he thinks that, at least.
Well, I think he has a pretty clear understanding,
yeah.
right? He says at the end, he goes, "We've run out of time. It's not going to happen." So he knows too, to some extent, that, hey, maybe God can cure illnesses. Maybe God has some power over our lives. But in this situation, it's not happening. Like, we need to take a little bit of action in this because they love their son, obviously.
That was one little logical gap that I had a bit of trouble.
I don't know if it's a logical gap as much as a human thing.
Well, okay, but what I am referencing is the fact that he makes the decision to cut off his son's arm with an electric saw on the kitchen table with veterinary supplies as the only anesthetics available and no one with medical experience present. And it's this very extreme decision that stems from his desire to help his son without sending his son to an established hospital or more traditional medical community, because that seems like maybe he believes it's too far out of the faith or something. But then so quickly after that, he is like cut off his son's arm, an hour prior, and then all it takes is like one person to come in and be like, "We should take him to a hospital." And then the dad is like, "Oh, okay, yeah, we should take him to a hospital. I guess I shouldn't have cut his arm off. We should have just taken him to a hospital like an hour ago, right before I cut his arm off."
Yeah,
it was a little bit like, it kind of felt to me for a minute like the de-arming sequence perhaps was included, or at least was not removed, because it added a bit of shock value to the climactic scene. It
showed parallel to Mara's snake judgment scene, so it's like
and that felt a bit forced to me. That parallel felt a bit forced. But sorry, that does not discredit the point you were making about the transformation this character undergoes.
Whether or not that was a little bit of a logical gap, it came across to me that the writing is trying to walk the balance between real humans, how they interact with religion, where they say often that they know that God is the controller of everything and controls every aspect of our life and has power over every aspect of our life, and at the same time know deep down in some situations that they're going to have to take action for one reason or another. However they justify it, there are certain situations where you just know you have to jump in, whether it's fatherly and motherly instinct or who can say, but you see that countless times with the extreme Christian situation of everyone says abortions are bad until the situation comes up where you have to choose. That's an extreme situation, but you know what I'm saying, right?
That this survival instinct kicks in where people kind of realize that something needs to happen and they take action when it does. Yeah. That ties nicely into this point that you haven't quite touched on yet, I think. Perhaps if you feel like touching on it, you don't have to.
No, I think that does segue nicely. A criticism that I might make on the film is it occasionally feels like we're exploiting this group of redneck backwoods community, but ultimately, I felt that a couple times in the film, but ultimately at the end thought that it was able to balance the point between full-on rednecks are bad, this kind of community is bad, and changing it into we're setting up a very difficult situation for people and seeing how they react to it, right? We're seeing that these communities can put women and men also into impossibly difficult situations, and we're using the medium of intense religious devotion to show that.
I'm curious if there are any instances in particular where you saw that judgmental lens particularly strong, like the negative depiction of the community.
the scene with like healing the child, that kind of thing, like seeing that element was kind of overdone, and it was an opportunity for Walton Goggins, right, to come in and yell at the demons to get out of this child.
Mhm.
The dialogue there, and a lot of the dialogue of Walton Goggins, not that I don't think his performance was great, but I think the dialogue was a little heavy in its, explicit Pentecostal, intense religious wording. Like, it seemed it could have been more nuanced, and that was probably the least nuanced element of the film. The dialogue that they had throwing out religious words that
Hallelujah,
you're not clear,
yeah.
right? You're not clear that they even really fully understand what they mean, and the sermons that Walton Goggins gives being very generic, and I don't remember I wish I could remember the exact wording, because I had a very distinct feeling of this is going down the path of two sides, right? Of the side saying, here's these intense religious people, and we're going to break away from that to the good side. Like, that was the sense I was getting with some of the early dialogue, just because it was so heavy in this obviously intense and dividing dialogue.
Well, and also this is a movie called Them That Follow, and it contains these sermons that have this intense rhetoric pushing the people of this community to continue following or to be damned for their sins.
Yeah.
There are multiple points in the film where the word follow is specifically dropped, and then the end of the film is one of the characters finally like not following and breaking free. So, in that sense it's a bit blunt, and
it's a bit heavy-handed.
It's not a subtle film.
But I think we've already discussed that there's more nuance than that. It was just an early sense that I got.
Mm-hmm. There's more nuance in the details, even if the broad strokes are a bit, as you said,
and I think
ham-fisted.
It felt like, and maybe it's just because I don't know anyone in this specific situation, but it felt like the universal devotion that everyone had, right, not even having any other aspect of their life, seemed a little unrealistic to me, right? It seemed that there must be even a little tiny bit more to some of these characters than just what we saw. And at the beginning, I wasn't getting that sense. Luckily, by the end, when the events started taking hold, it felt like there was humans that were intensely devoted, that had nuance to them. And I think that was just shown probably to initially give some shock and development into the intensity of the situation. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
That level of bluntness struck me as a little over the top, but it got there.
Speaking of over the top, one question I have, how did no one deduce that Mara's baby daddy was Augie, given that it seems to me that Augie and Garrett were the only two non-married men.
Maybe, I think that's why Garrett
community.
figured it out pretty early, or at least at the midpoint of the film when she kept going like up to his room, right? He's like,
something fishy going on.
Like, he's the only other man here that's my age, so...
Right. Yeah, and like she's spending a lot of time up in the bedroom with him, and everyone else is just like, nah, I don't know.
Yeah,
man.
even Walton Goggins was like, oh yeah, you just gotta, she's just doing her part. You gotta just do your part for the faith. Yeah, I thought that was pretty funny. Yeah. But to be honest, we really don't see a lot of friendly relationships, right? There's just church relationships, marriage relationships. Mara doesn't have friends, we realize by the end.
Right, one pseudo-friendship.
They're all just church members interacting with each other like they're always at church.
Is there anything else you wanted to touch on before we wrapped it up?
I think we've been able to deduce that there's a little bit more to the film than meets the eye. And I'm actually surprised at how low the reviews are. I'm not surprised that audiences are panned, because it's a very humorless movie.
Yeah, it's pretty cold.
Yeah.
Although it doesn't feel empty. It definitely
feels...
feels...
it's not bleak, but it's very serious.
It's very serious. No, I agree. The reviews have been pretty mixed, and I'm not surprised that we're not seeing universal acclaim.
Right, it's not that good.
Or it seems like the kind of film that's flawed enough to be divisive, but I'm surprised that we're tending towards the middle of the spectrum as opposed to like pretty
upper middle,
positive. I don't know. I would have guessed this film to have a higher Rotten Tomatoes percentage.
Yeah, a higher critic score for sure.
So there you have it. Them That Follow is underrated.
There we go.
I would put this in my top 10 films of 2019 so far, and I haven't seen as many films in 2019 as someone running a movie podcast maybe should, but I definitely was impressed by this film and am totally sold on this directing duo as one to watch.
Yes. I don't know if I'd put it top 10, definitely top 20. I really liked the film, though.
I have 26 movies that I've seen in 2019. It's just on Letterboxd.
Right. I should keep track.
Definitely top 20 for me, though.
Yeah, definitely top 20.
It's above Stuber.
Yeah, above Stuber.
I think that about wraps up our discussion of Them That Follows for the time being. I do hope that more people go out and watch this movie than have so far.
It deserves it, even if it's not the easiest watch. Even if it's imperfect, it'll give you a lot to think about, I think.
Mm-hmm. And there's snakes. So if you're scared of snakes,
you'll lose it for the whole film.
Yeah, dude, you'll be freaking out.
Yeah, be feeling like there's a snake coming at any second.
You'll be riding that high, baby, for 98 minutes.
Yeah. I personally am not really afraid of snakes, so I thought they were able to convey the intensity with the filmmaking.
Yeah, I didn't want those guys on me when I was watching it. I mean, I had a pet snake, but I'm not going to let a rattlesnake crawl on me.
I don't think they even used a rattlesnake.
Like, you thought it was obvious that it wasn't a rattlesnake?
Yeah.
How could you tell?
Because it didn't look like a rattlesnake. It had, like, different color and spots and stuff.
I thought it was, like, a special kind of rattlesnake. Like,
it didn't have a rattle tail either.
It didn't?
No.
That seems like an oversight.
Yeah.
Couldn't they have, like, put a...
I think they just assumed that you wouldn't be looking for it.
Wow. That is,
They did, like, they showed it in the one scene, like, where it coils up at the beginning. Remember when they're, like, initially looking to trap some rattlesnakes? Like, those were rattlesnakes, but the ones they actually were crawling didn't have the tail. And, I mean, I know why they didn't, so that nobody got bit and died, but...
Damn, still, though, like, come on.
Yeah, I know. They were committed in every way, but couldn't do the snakes.
But not that one. Yeah. Absolutely unbelievable.
Unbelievable.
Don't go see this movie. Disappointingly low amount of rattlesnakes in it. All right, so next week on Rattlesnakes in Cinema, we're going to talk about snakes on a plane.
Yeah, I knew it. That was good.
Dude, we're so good together. All right, thank you everyone for tuning in to episode 3. Plan for episode 4 is be coming at you soon. So stay tuned. Baby.
Stay tuned. Listen for it next week. Woot woot.
Woot. Oh, and also, maybe we should start adding this tag at the end of our episodes. If you enjoyed the episode this week, please give us a follow. We're on Facebook. We're on Instagram. We're even tweeters. Everything the cool kids are on. You can bet we're on it too. It's at About Movies CI.
For Cory and Isaac.
For Cory and Isaac, yeah. Yeah, we were initially doing at AM Cory Isaac, and then we realized Cory and Isaac are both names that people mess up the spelling all the time. So
we also realized that if you're listening to this, you probably already are following us because you probably know us. But if you're not, definitely do it.
On the off chance you aren't.
Now you do know us, and you are our friend if you're listening to this.
You have no excuse. We'll find you.
Exactly. We know who you are. Spotify keeps track of everything.
We have your IP address.
Exactly.
Anyways, thanks for listening, guys. We really appreciate your support, and we'll be back soon for more discussion about movies.
Goodbye.